Imagine being trapped in a steel coffin as the ocean crushes in around you. That was the reality for 30,000 German submariners during Operation Raspberry, an Allied campaign that turned the Atlantic into a graveyard. The hunters had become the hunted. No one knew who would disappear next, and it terrified them. On today's episode of the Infographics Show, we reveal how one operation turned Nazi Germany's lethal U-boats into tombs. The interior of U-534 in April 1945 was sensory overload of the worst kind. Unwashed men pressed shoulder to shoulder. Showers were a luxury submariners couldn't afford. Diesel fuel permeated everything, even the food, and the acrid smell of fear lingered in the recycled air. Condensation dripped steadily from the pressured hull, and that's what happens when 49 men breathe in an enclosed space for weeks on end. The red emergency lighting deepened the claustrophobia, casting an unnatural pall over the crew. This was the office, quarters, rec room, and home of Captain Lieutenant Herbert Nolau, all contained within a steel tube beneath the Atlantic. Nolau had commanded U-boats for 3 separate patrols, totaling 160 days. He knew exactly what the rhythmic ping of Allied sonar meant. Somewhere above them, lurking in the darkness, destroyer propellers churned the water. The sound was getting louder, closer. Being hunted underwater was a terrifying prospect. The German crew couldn't see their pursuer, they couldn't outrun them, and they couldn't fight back effectively. Every time Nolau's crew heard the distant boom of the depth charges, they went silent. They had been playing this game for 6 hours now. Every man knew the odds, and the odds were they were probably gonna die. In the crimson half-light, they waited, knowing the next hammering concussion could crush their hull or drive them to the surface, where British destroyer crews called the slaughter a turkey shoot. The U-534's fate would be a strange coda to that grim tally. Nolau had taken her on 2 patrols in the North Atlantic before setting out once more in May 1945. On the 5th, several days after Germany's surrender, she shot down an RAF Liberator over the Kattegat, only to be sunk minutes later by another Liberator from 86th Squadron. 9 depth charges pinned her in, and one last charge sealed her fate northwest of Helsingør, Denmark. Strangely, much of the crew survived, an outlier among their peers. This was submarine warfare in 1945. This was Operation Raspberry. The Atlantic had gone from being the U-boat's hunting ground to an underwater cemetery with remarkably efficient undertakers. So how did they do it? First, let's talk statistics, because the numbers that justified killing operations like Raspberry were both staggering and existential. Between 1939 and 45, German U-boats sank almost 2,800 Allied merchant vessels, over 14 million tons of shipping. For perspective, roughly equivalent to sinking the entire modern U.S. Navy 3 times over. At the campaign's height in 1942, Britain was burning through supplies faster than convoys could deliver them. Admiral Karl Donitz, the U-boat fleet commander who would briefly become Hitler's successor after hearing about the job in his boss's obituary, had built his entire strategy on brutal mathematics. He called it the tonnage war, sinking Allied merchant ships faster than American and British shipyards could replace them. Britain would be starved into submission without a single German soldier setting foot on English soil. It was actually working, too. In early 1943, Donitz commanded 400 operational U-boats, and his wolfpacks were sending around 600,000 tons of shipping to the bottom every month. That was roughly 1 large merchant ship every 2 hours, around the clock for weeks on end. The Type 7 U-boat was the Toyota Corolla of submarines. In 1943, it was reliable and it was everywhere. Capable of carrying 14 torpedoes, it could travel 8,500 nautical miles in a single mission. Type 9 boats pushed even further, showing up off of American beaches and in the Caribbean. Each torpedo that connected could send 10,000 tons of cargo and dozens of merchant sailors into the freezing Atlantic. The U-boat's lethality stemmed from the fact that Donitz had essentially invented modern submarine warfare by studying wolves, actual wolves, and adapting their pack hunting strategies to metal tubes operating underwater. Instead of hunting alone, U-boats would form patrol lines across known convoy routes. When one boat spotted a convoy, it would radio the position, fully cognizant the British might intercept the transmission, and then they would shadow the targets while broadcasting updates, as other boats would converge. Once the pack assembled, they would attack in coordinated waves, usually at night when their low surface profile made them nearly invisible against the dark water. The submarines themselves were genuinely impressive feats of engineering. A Type 7C could dive 750 feet in emergencies, the water pressure at that depth at over 350 pounds per square inch. They could remain submerged for days, though the air quality degraded to the point where even if they were allowed to smoke, lighting a cigarette became virtually impossible due to oxygen depletion. By 1943, they had acoustic torpedoes that could hone in on propeller sounds, making evasion nearly impossible for slow-moving merchant vessels. It was like giving the wolves heat-seeking fangs. The tonnage equation and technological superiority worked beautifully for Donitz and Germany for nearly 2 years, until suddenly it didn't. May 1943, forever known as Black May in U-boat circles, changed everything. Donitz lost 41 submarines that month. That is 41 out of 240 operational boats in 30 days. It was a watershed moment. The exchange rate had reversed catastrophically. For every Allied ship sunk, nearly one U-boat was destroyed. On May 24, 1943, Donitz did something previously unthinkable. He withdrew his boats from the North Atlantic entirely. It was the first admission that the hunters had become the hunted. The Allies had cracked Enigma, developed better sonar, deployed long-range aircraft, and fundamentally altered the game. By 1944, what had become known as Operation Raspberry had become a systematic extermination campaign. The Atlantic had become a killing field, and German submariners drew the short straw. Operation Raspberry didn't start with new and improved depth charges or military hardware, but with mathematicians and crossword puzzle enthusiasts. Maverick thinkers at Bletchley Park had already achieved the impossible by breaking the German naval Enigma code. The Western Approaches Tactical Unit, or WATU, formed in 1942 under Captain Gilbert Roberts, became the secret brain trust behind Allied anti-U-boat tactics. Staffed heavily by Wrens from the Women's Royal Naval Service, including mathematical prodigies like Laura Janet Howes, WATU reconstructed real convoy engagements as war games on a giant foregrid. The U-boat side had an unrestricted view of the board, while escort commanders played behind the scenes with limited visibility, mirroring the fog of real combat. By replaying these scenarios over and over, WATU's analytical team spotted patterns U-boat captains were exploiting. One revelation was that many U-boats attacked from within convoys after slipping in from the rear under darkness. The solution spawned the Raspberry maneuver. Once a merchant was torpedoed, escorts would launch rockets, call out Raspberry, and then sweep in from the flanks while lighting the sea surface with star shells. WATU then trained hundreds of officers, British and Allied, each week in applying these techniques in real convoys. In short, puzzle solvers and mathematical thinkers had turned war games into live tactics. Their relentless trial and error pattern detection and methodical training turned the Atlantic from a U-boat playground into a tactical graveyard. It was so effective that by 1944, British intelligence could read and predict Donitz's operational orders almost as quickly as his own commanders received them. Eventually, the submarine tracking room in London's Admiralty evolved into something out of a Tom Clancy novel. A war room lined with massive wall charts, constantly updated positions, and intelligence officers moving markers with long wooden pointers. They knew where the German U-boats were. Not approximately, not sometimes, nearly always. It helped that radio direction finding stations, affectionately called Huff Duff because Huff Duff sounds like someone sneezing, could triangulate German radio transmissions across the Atlantic. When a U-boat captain radioed headquarters about a convoy sighting, Allied operators could fix his position within a few dozen nautical miles, and they would dispatch the kill teams to these specific Atlantic corridors where hunter-killer groups waited. This intelligence architecture meant that by 1944, very few U-boats operated without the Allies knowing approximately where they were. The entire U-boat killing process followed a methodical sequence. For years, the mid-Atlantic Gap had been the U-boat's safe space, that portion of ocean beyond the range of land-based aircraft where submarines could surface, recharge their batteries, and cruise undisturbed. By 1944, that gap no longer existed. Very long-range B-24 Liberator bombers, modified with extra fuel tanks, could patrol the entire Atlantic. Massive and graceful British short Sunderland flying boats, absolutely bristling with weapons, provided around-the-clock coverage. These aircraft carried centimetric radar that could detect a submarine's conning tower from miles away, even at night or in fog. U-boats spent most of their time on the surface. Their electric motors underwater were painfully slow, and batteries lasted only a few hours. So when one was spotted, Allied ships didn't hesitate. They attacked or radioed in its position. The Lee light deserves special mention. Imagine you are a U-boat commander cruising on the surface at night, feeling safe under the cover of darkness. Suddenly, a 22 million candela searchlight slams on from the sky, turning your conning tower into a stage prop and you into the unwilling star of a show. The genius behind it was Wing Commander Humphrey de Verde Lee, who realized that early radar lost contact just as aircraft closed in. His solution? Flick on the light the instant a U-boat vanished from the radar screen, giving the bomber crew a perfect view while leaving the submarine no time to dive. First introduced in June 1942, the effect was devastating, so much so that German subs had to switch to recharging their batteries in the daylight, when at least they could see what was coming. The Germans scrambled to respond with the Metox radar detector, which sniffed out Allied radar signals and sometimes gave U-boats just enough warning to escape. But the Allies countered with the ASV Mark III centimetric radar, nullifying Metox and keeping the pressure on. By the time the Germans rolled out their Naxos receiver in reply, the U-boat force was already bleeding to death. The Lee light paired with radar had changed the game forever. This marked the beginning of Phase 2 of Operation Raspberry. By 1944, the Allies had developed specialized anti-submarine task forces that made early war convoy escorts look like amateurs with depth charges. These hunter-killer groups centered on escort carriers, small aircraft carriers converted from merchant hulls, accompanied by destroyer escorts that bristled with detection equipment. The destroyer escorts carried Type 144 sonar with significantly improved range and accuracy. Once sonar operators gained contact, they could track it continuously while coordinating with other ships. Wolfpack tactics were now turned against the Germans. Multiple vessels would box in the U-boat. The geometry was precise and ruthless. Maintain contact, close the escape routes, begin the attack. It's worth noting that sonar operators became incredibly skilled at their jobs. They could distinguish between a submarine, a whale, a school of fish, or a temperature gradient in the water that submarines would try to hide under. The best operators could tell you not just where the submarine was, but what type it was and which direction it was heading. It was now time to factor in refinements in depth charge technology, which played a crucial role in turning the tide. By 1944, the new Torpex explosive compound delivered 50% more destructive power than TNT. These charges could be preset to detonate at depths of up to 900 feet, deeper than most U-boats could dive. Allied ships dropped them in carefully calculated patterns with names like Square Search and Creeping Attack, and their hydrostatic shockwaves were designed to pulverize men from the inside out. Then there was the Hedgehog. This forward-throwing mortar fired 24 contact-fused projectiles in an elliptical pattern ahead of the attacking ship. Unlike depth charges, which had to be dropped behind the ship and obscured sonar with their explosions, Hedgehog projectiles only detonated on direct impact with the submarine's hull. When a Hedgehog projectile hit, it punched through the pressured hull like a railroad spike through sheet metal. Each hit was a death sentence. We should briefly clarify what actually happens when a depth charge explodes near a submarine, because Hollywood gets this spectacularly wrong. Water is incompressible. This is crucial. When an explosive detonates in the air, the pressure wave disperses relatively quickly. In water, it travels farther and faster, carrying far more destructive energy. A depth charge exploding within 20 feet of a U-boat's hull could rupture the seams, shatter internal equipment, and kill crew members through the concussion alone. And that is without even breaching the pressure hull. Men's internal organs would hemorrhage, eardrums would rupture, people would be killed by pressure waves passing through their bodies. If the hull did breach, even a small hole, the result was catastrophically rapid. At 300 feet depth, water pressure exceeds 130 pounds per square inch. For comparison, a typical car tire is inflated to about 32 psi. A fist-sized hole in the hull at that depth would let water in with the force of a fire hose on steroids. Compartments flooded in seconds. Watertight doors might isolate the flooding if crew members could reach them, but submarines rarely maintained buoyancy even with one compartment flooded. Then, the boat would begin its last dive. And here is where physics becomes truly horrifying. At 900 feet, twice the rated crush depth of a Type 7, the pressure hull would implode. Not explode, implode. The difference matters. The implosion happened faster than human perception, crushing everything inside as the seal collapsed inward. Bodies, equipment, and structure compacted together in microseconds. Modern sonar surveys show some wrecks with hulls compressed to half their original diameter. For submarines forced to surface by damage, the outcome was often worse. Destroyer deck guns could traverse quickly to target the conning tower. Crews attempting to abandon ship faced machine gun fire, a practice that, while controversial and officially discouraged, was widespread and grimly practical. Now that's the sanitized version. The reality was worse. German survivors who lived through depth charge attacks, and there weren't many, described hours of what could only be called underwater psychological torture. Commanders would order silent running beneath a certain depth with all machinery stopped. Crew members breathing shallowly, absolute silence maintained. Men stood frozen at their stations, not daring to move, while destroyer propellers churned overhead and depth charges detonated. Light bulbs shattered in their sockets. Insulation used to reduce condensation rained down like toxic snow. Hydraulic lines burst, spraying oil that made everything slippery and reeked of petroleum. Gauges cracked, and always the question hammering in every man's mind: will the next explosion be the one that breaks through? When the hull did breach, there was rarely time for life jackets or orderly evacuation procedures. The North Atlantic averaged 50 degrees Fahrenheit, which was cold enough to kill through hypothermia in under an hour, even if you reached the surface. But most submariners never got that chance. They drowned in darkness as the ocean poured in at impossible pressure. Others died instantly when the hull imploded on its way down. Some suffocated when damaged diving systems failed to blow the ballast tanks, trapping them on the bottom as the air slowly ran out. Some submarines sank slowly enough the crew members had time to realize what was happening. Time to write one last message they knew no one would ever read. Time to pray or to curse or simply to wait in the darkness as the depth gauge needle crept past the crush depth marking. The pressure hull would scream, a metallic shriek as the steel began to fail, and then nothing. Between 1944 and 1945, when operations like Raspberry reached peak efficiency, U-boat losses accelerated to genuinely unsustainable levels. In 1944 alone, 242 U-boats were destroyed, nearly one every day and a half. Germany was producing submarines, training crews, sending them out, and having them sunk faster than they could complete a single war patrol. In January 1945, 13 boats were lost. In February, 21 more. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, Donitz commanded barely 150 operational submarines from a force that had once numbered over 400. Operation Raspberry's specific kill zones showed up dramatically in the data. The approaches to German-occupied French ports, Brest, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, became graveyards with German signage. U-boats departing on patrol faced gauntlets of aircraft and hunter-killer groups. Even boats that made it past the coastal defenses found the Atlantic itself had become hostile territory. The Bay of Biscay earned the nickname Valley of Death among German submariners. When sailors start naming geographic features after death, you know morale is tanking. Donitz kept sending them out anyway. Orders are orders even when they are death sentences. Modern underwater archaeology has become something like forensic pathology for naval warfare. Over 200 U-boat wreck sites have been located and mapped in the Atlantic, and each one tells a specific story about how it died. Take U-515, sunk by the destroyer escort USS Chatillon on April 9, 1944. Side-scan sonar shows characteristic hedgehog damage, the bow section torn open where contact-fused projectiles punched through the pressure hull. The submarine sank in less than 2 minutes. Of the 60 men aboard, 16 died. The 44 survivors were picked up only because the sea was relatively calm and the attack occurred during daylight hours. Those two factors, calm seas and daylight, rarely aligned. Most submarine crews that went down did so at night in rough weather, which meant even surface survivors had minimal chance. U-546, destroyed on April 24, 1945 by 8 destroyer escorts working in coordination, shows what overwhelming force actually looked like. This wreck indicates that she was caught on the surface by aircraft, forced to dive while damaged, then systematically hunted for 11 hours. Though it's tough to imagine being underwater in a damaged submarine for 11 hours while 5 ships take turns dropping depth charges, eventually the aft section crushed under pressure. When the boat finally surfaced out of control, sailors attempting to abandon ship faced deck gun fire. Much of the crew survived, and only because one destroyer captain, against standing orders, ceased fire to allow rescue. That captain probably saved 33 lives. However, 8 of the survivors were later tortured by U.S. military personnel. Operation Raspberry's impact went beyond the submarines it destroyed. The psychological effect on surviving U-boat crews became a factor German naval headquarters couldn't ignore. By early 1945, some boats spent entire patrols submerged in distant waters, avoiding combat entirely, just trying to survive until the war ended. Crews that did engage increasingly faced mutinous sentiment. Donitz's operational orders became increasingly desperate and frankly disconnected from reality. He commanded boats to attack regardless of risk, knowing most would not return. Some commanders disobeyed orders and remained submerged, waiting for the inevitable German surrender. Others followed orders and simply disappeared. The Atlantic swallowed them without leaving much of a trace beyond an oil slick and some floating debris. With the U-boat threat neutralized, convoy routes from America to Britain became reliable highways for war material. The D-Day invasion in June 1944 was possible partly because Operation Raspberry and similar campaigns had cleared the western approaches of submarine threats. The ocean floor keeps most U-boat tombs and their victims largely undisturbed. Sonar scans show them scattered across the seabed, monuments to industrial warfare's capacity to kill efficiently and without mercy. The water is cold, dark, and silent. The steel has been corroding for 8 decades. The dead have been waiting there in the deep since 1945. They are not waiting for rescue anymore, just recognition that they were there, that they fought, that they died, and that war underwater is perhaps the most terrible kind of all. Operation Raspberry turned German U-boats into underwater graves, but not every crew met the same fate. Watch the greatest submarine rescue ever, escaping sinking submarine USS Squalus, to see the mission that defied the odds, or click on this video instead.